Hi, welcome. My name is Bonnie, and I'm coming to you live from Texas. And I'm happy to be here today. Thank you so much for joining me. Today, I'm going to talk with you about what I call lateral language learning. Lateral language learning. And just to give you a heads up on this session is really intended for teachers who are working specifically with language learners. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Um, just one moment. Checking. And now, let's see. Share. Okay. Um, Sorry. Let's see. Application window. Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. Present to everyone. I think we are good to go now. Um, hmm. Okay. Hopefully that's working. Okay. Here we go. So, like I said, this is lateral language learning. And just to give you a background of who it is that you're listening to for the next few minutes, I myself am in my 24th year as a teacher, and 11 of those years have been specifically as an ESL, an English as a second language teacher. And I do just want to give a quick shout out to my amazing school, which I love, George Junior High. Go Gators! All right, so let's start with what lateral language learning, or L3, is for short. L3 is a framework in which you, as the educator, are simultaneously learning a language alongside your students. I'm going to repeat that. L3 is where you, as the educator, are simultaneously learning a language alongside your students. So, I'm just going to begin with telling you my story, and then I'm going to talk about what I've learned and how you can incorporate this idea into a classroom. Okay, some background. In my first 10 years of teaching in an ESL classroom, my students were in grades 3, 4, and 5, and for the most part, they were really eager to learn English. Also, these students spoke a wide variety of all different languages. In many cases, also, they had studied some English back in their native countries before they came to America. And so oftentimes they came to me with at least some foundation in English, some knowledge. So bottom line, they were motivated. And I think most people who work with language learners understand that motivation is a key factor, some would say the most important factor, in learning a new language. So it was fairly easy to teach those kids. And so my teaching in that setting just felt effective and productive. So fast forward to the current 2018-2019 school year. My situation is I'm teaching 7th and 8th grade students. They're new immigrants to the United States. They have arrived with no English. And literally all of my students are Spanish speakers, and all of them come from one of these three countries, either Mexico, Honduras, or El Salvador. And when the school year began, there was a general feeling of tension really coming from my students. I would say not all of them, but definitely most of them. And what felt like to me resentment towards me and absolute unwillingness to learn. So this was new to me. I kind of walked in thinking that this classroom would be like my past experience. Now, I've since learned that in the beginning, these kids saw me as sort of the enemy. I was just the lady who was going to force them to learn English against their wills, and they really weren't buying it. So they were aggressively in protest. All right, now that I have drawn out their stories, though, What I know is this. I know that about half of my newcomer students had recently gone through some pretty harrowing things coming to America, including being, in one case, separated at the border from a parent and then sent to an accompanied minor facility in Miami. Some kids leaving family behind in their native countries, and in some cases, packing and leaving very quickly without any goodbye to those family members or to friends. In a couple of cases, they traveled alone here with no family. In many of them, about half of my kids have told me now that they spent days in those cages that we have all seen images of. So the point here is, regardless of your stance on the political argument, I found myself in a room full of students who didn't choose to be here and had zero motivation to learn from me. They were experiencing a lot of fear, anxiety, and mistrust. So I just found myself scouring all the many books that I have in my professional library and using all of my best methods to try to lower the effective filter, as Krashen would say, and planning all these creative, engaging lessons. And really, no matter what I tried, it was proving a real challenge to reach these students. I had done all the things, in the checklist, smiled, warm, positive environment. I set my expectations. We built a social contract. But they would often carry on conversations in Spanish during class, sometimes kind of murmuring, and then would look at me and laugh. And one day, a sweet girl in that class, in one of my classes, stayed afterwards, and she let me know that she's like, I just want to let you know, all the kids are constantly talking about you. They're calling you names. They're saying really rude comments. So it frustrated me. I was trying really hard, and this is what they were doing. So quite honestly, it kind of angered me. And so I thought, all right, well, I'll show them. I will just learn Spanish, and then they can't talk behind my back, and I'll know what they're saying. All right, so side note here, and this is why I'm showing this slide. I really like to say that at this point, my motives were really super noble, like, oh, I'm just going to enter their world and remove the barrier between us, and I'll be connected to them. But if I'm honest with myself, really, in that moment that I decided to start learning Spanish, it really was a survival tactic. And yet, having said that, I did truly want to build relationships with my students. I don't know how you become a teacher without wanting that. And by the way, also, don't want to make it sound like no learning was happening at this point in my classroom, because it was, but it really did just feel like a slow, arduous daily struggle. Okay, so moving on. So I started slow and small by just downloading the Duolingo app on my phone and doing about 10 minutes a day. And lo and behold, I found myself over the next few weeks understanding quite a lot of their conversations in class. And it began, of course, just recognizing a word here or there. But now I could understand the difference between if someone was just asking a friend to borrow a pencil or they were sneakily eating food in class, because now I've learned the words lápiz and comida. All right, so the fun began when I started surprising my students by responding to what they had said. Now, I responded in English to their Spanish, but it always surprised them, and it was started to show them what I was learning. Someone would say something like, Estoy cansado, solo quiero irme a casa. And I would say, yes, I understand. I'm tired too. And I would get shocked expressions. At this point, I told them, yes, I've decided to learn Spanish. And little by little, I've found ways to incorporate my learning into the classroom. So they seemed to sit up and take notice of this and really start to respond. And I noticed the murmuring rudeness subsided, and it felt like a real change was happening. It seemed to me that they felt interested and kind of happy to see what I was doing. And one day, my assistant principal was in my classroom, and she commented later that she noticed that whenever I read or spoke or tried anything in Spanish, the entire class collectively kind of physically sat up in response to what I was doing. So then my goal became I'm going to model what it can look like to be a language learner. And since they weren't exactly model learners at this point, I decided to show them by modeling. So for instance, in my teaching, I would use the Spanish equivalent word often when teaching new vocabulary so they would understand. And I would say those words in Spanish, but then I would always ask my students, okay, can you help me? Did I pronounce that correctly? And they responded beautifully. So they would either affirm what I was saying or they would coach me and say the word for me so that I could learn. And then I would always say at the end of that back and forth, I would say, thank you. That's really helpful. So on and on this pattern continued. And then when they were given a writing assignment, I would sit in one of the student desks and I would tell them, okay, while you guys are writing in English, because that's the language you're learning, I'm going to be doing my own version in Spanish since I need to practice that. All right, and you can see from these samples that I'm showing you, I will tell you the one on the left is one I wrote on my whiteboard, and the students, this is fixed. So my verbs were all wrong, and it was just the first 2 or 3 sentences of what was going to be a creative story or like just an original fictional story. The one on the right was really a mess, but it was interesting when I passed that paper around and let my students read it. They were like, we completely know what you're trying to say here. We understand your message. And yes, there's like 100 mistakes, but we get what you're trying to say here. And I did have to put in Margarita Frio because, you know, I only know limited Spanish. So yes, that is in that paper. But, and like I put here, I did what my students do. I got the verbs wrong. I just used over and over words that I know because those are the words I know. That's all I can do. And sometimes when I just didn't know the Spanish word, I just substituted the English word because I didn't know what else I couldn't use a Spanish word because I don't know it. So I made all those same kind of task errors that I see in my language learners, and it's just part of the process. So another way I would use this is when we do dictation sentences, which now we refer to only as dictado in my class. So we take turns. So I will give my students a sentence in English, and then I walk around and I check and correct what they've written. And then I call on one of them to give me a sentence in Spanish. And I type it on the smartboard, and then they check my work and correct it. So they absolutely love doing this. So doing little bits and pieces in class in Spanish makes everything else we do in English so much more effective and productive. And over time, this approach has built more trust than I could have imagined. So now, because I am asking them daily for some kind of help or some kind of knowledge, it's just opened them up to asking a ton more questions of me. And naturally, I'll say, since my job is to promote their language acquisition, the overwhelming majority of my time in class is all about English. But the little droplets of Spanish are always time well spent. All right, side note. I do realize that not everyone has a classroom like mine where every one of your language learners speaks the same language. Like all of my students, their first language is Spanish. So I get that that's not always the case. And that really is okay, because I would say it doesn't matter so much what language you choose to be learning. It's more about your students seeing you in the process and feeling greater trust and openness because you're entering into their experience in real time. So if you have multiple languages in your classroom, simply choose one and allow the students to see the learning that you are able to model. I would equate this to someone who has not exercised in a long time. And when you start trying to do that from the beginning, sometimes it's just hard to get going. So there's just a huge difference between trying to go it alone or having an exercise buddy, someone who's working out alongside you. So now you're sweating together, you're working hard together, you're enjoying successes together, but you're also sometimes unmotivated and you're sore and you're tired and you don't want to do it, but you pick each other back up. And this is how it is when you're learning a language at the same time that your students are. And I will say that this literally happened to me on Friday. What was that, 2 days ago? I was reading some text from the smartboard in my classroom. It was the Spanish translation of something that all of my students had the English text at their desks. They had copies of. But I was reading this aloud in Spanish just so they understand the content and they could kind of match up words and really understand the social studies content that we were doing here. And I got about 3/4 of the way through this pretty long reading. And I just had botched a lot of things and made a lot of errors, and I wanted to quit. And so I literally said in my classroom, I said, well, you know what, you guys get the idea, you can read the rest of it on your own. And one of my students, one sweet girl, said, no, keep going, you got this, don't give up. And so her encouragement was amazing to me. So I did. I kept going. I finished the reading, and she gave me a high five. And so that's the kind of back and forth encouragement that I'm talking about. And seeing that, process, like they get to do that with me, they're so much more open when I am coaching them. So even if you've previously studied a language, because some of you out there are going to say, well, you know what, I've studied a language before, I'm not interested in doing that. So you probably have studied a language in high school or college, but I would argue, did you actually acquire that language? And are you currently fluent in whatever language that is or was? And so maybe you have forgotten what it's like to struggle to acquire language. All right, so now there is currently a culture of reciprocal teaching and learning. There is truly a positive energy in my classroom. And I can say there's just no pushback in this class from the students. This whole thing has increased my empathy for what my students are experiencing, and we're all experiencing this together in real time. Despite all the training and all the books and all the tricks of the trade, there really, to me, is no substitute for going through this process of language acquisition alongside my students. My students and I are vulnerable with each other. We make mistakes, but we keep trying. We take risks. And I share my writing with them, and it's a mess because, like I said, I don't know the sentence structure and the verbs are hard, but I do it, and I'm brave about revealing what I don't know. And in those moments, too, I would add, they get to be the experts. And this is incredible to watch because in no other class during their day do they get to be the experts. When I think about how these brand new immigrants with little to no English have to spend every day at school struggling to comprehend and seeking out cues and visuals and just not knowing, I think that this could tend to make a student feel less smart, and that's just not true. So with the setup in this classroom right now for me, these kids get lots of opportunities to be the pros and to teach their teacher. It's awesome. Here I've got a picture of a girl writing some stuff on the board for me. She made this chart for me so that I would understand the articles better. And it just was that little visual that she wrote on the board for me, super helpful. Okay, so I just want to talk really quickly about what I learned overall during this process. All right, one thing is this. I have often encouraged my students to go home and I've told them, just watch an English TV show because you're going to get exposure to language and learn new words. And it worked for Emily Francis. So, of course, it's a great idea. But even though I've said that to them, watching Spanish TV is the last thing I want to do when I get home from work because my brain is tired and I'm just mentally done. So I need to understand, why is it going to be any different for my students? And if they do choose to use this strategy and it helps them, great. But no pressure because I get it. I'm done at that point as well. All right. Number 2, in case you're hearing all and thinking all this, I don't want to learn another language. I've got no use for that. It sounds like a daunting task. I would say, guess what? Your students don't necessarily also want to learn another language either. But if they're going to live in the United States, the reality is that their opportunities are going to be greater if they're fluent in English. And I would argue definitely still even greater if they're bilingual. All right. 3rd, I learn and then I forget. I need repetition and I need practice. Just because I learned a word last week does not mean that I can remember for the life of me what that word was. I may remember what letter it started with, but I cannot call to mind necessarily everything I've learned when I want to. So, for instance, last week, I was trying to explain to a student who's only been in the United States for about 4 weeks that he's going to need to buy a ticket to go to a basketball game on campus. And I knew the word I wanted started with a B, but I just could not come up with boleto. I need repeated exposure with relevant context. I need opportunities to use new words in speech and in writing in order to master new vocabulary. All right, one helpful benefit here too is I can now tell who has a strong foundation in their first language. So when we do class dictation, dictado, for instance, There are a couple of my students who never are able to confirm for me if I have my Spanish sentence written correctly, but there are some students who always know every correct spelling and even subtleties like word usage or what could have been a more accurate verb choice. So this becomes very good information for me because, as we all know, students who are strong in their L1 in their native language typically can acquire a second language quicker and easier than those who have a weaker foundation in their native language. So it explains a lot for me. It gives me information. It tells me also who would be a good peer buddy for a brand new student who needs translation at the very beginning. All right. So I now want to share some ways that you could incorporate this into your own classroom. And first, I would say model, model, model what it looks like to be a willing learner, a risk taker, and to be vulnerable. These are all things I say on a regular basis. Will you teach me how to say this word? Is this correct? Am I pronouncing this right? Can you help me learn this word? And always, always end with thank you. That's super helpful. That's so helpful to me. I appreciate your help. Also, one thing I often do is, like I had mentioned, provide my students a copy of the text that we're reading in English, and then I project a Spanish translation of that exact text onto my smartboard. And then we either choral read a paragraph at a time. I might call on someone to read the English text, and then I read the Spanish text aloud while they follow along. This really helps them to start to match up words, to learn vocabulary using common cognates, and to just hear the English language read aloud, and to confirm comprehension of their actual content material, because they do have it also in their own native language on the board. So next, I would say that I use this a lot in writing, as I've talked about. So if the students are writing on a topic in English, I'm going back and forth between monitoring their progress at their seats and then conferencing with them a little bit. And then I'll take a break from that after a little while, and I will myself write for a few minutes in Spanish. And then I always share my work with them later so they can give me tips and tell me what to fix. And again, this is just part of the mutual learning experience. And sometimes we might just have like 3 minutes or so left at the end of the class period, and we've just finished everything that we wanted to accomplish for the day. So then in those cases, I might let the kids take out their phones, and everyone, including me, gets on Duolingo, because at this point now, all of my students have downloaded that app on their phone to help them with their English. And while they do their English practice, I use that opportunity to do my Spanish practice. Also, when they do sustained silent reading in class, they're reading out of English books. I'll pick up a Spanish language novel and practice my reading. And honestly, I would say whatever else you can think of. The possibilities are really endless. Whatever else you're doing in your classroom, you could incorporate little droplets of this philosophy and do this in your classroom with anything you're doing. So now, it is amazing because it is at the point now where in the passing period between classes, random students are constantly popping into my room between classes. They're just curious. What's happening in here? What goes on in here? What class is this? I wish I had this class. These are all kinds of comments that I hear on a pretty regular basis by just students who I don't even know who they are, don't know their names, or I've learned their names and now I'm, greeting them. But there's an energy as my students are entering the classroom, and I think it's inviting. There are hugs, there are fist bumps, high fives, laughter, smiles, and it's just kind of contagious. And it's really nothing I'm doing differently with regard to instruction or whatever. It's just about that I feel like I've found a way to empathize and create an emotionally safe learning environment for the students, and it shows. So it's all about respecting and addressing their need to feel embraced, understood, and accepted right where they are. So my classroom has transformed from feeling like it's me and them to it's us. I just want to also say that I'm just severely proud of these sweet students that I have. They are amazing people. They've been through so much. They are smart, and they are joyful and funny and resilient. And I feel fortunate to teach them. And we are now sharing a journey together. We are participating in a shared experience. All right. And if you're watching this and you're out there and you're teaching and you're working with students, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for what you do. It's the kind of job that I think is like no other, and you do not necessarily get the thanks that you deserve, but you are absolutely a rock star if you were doing this, and thank you. This is my contact information. I would love for you to contact me. I would welcome your feedback if anyone tries this in your classroom. Any thoughts that you have on it. I'm going to now exit this and come back to, all right, I think that we are good to go. Okay. And so thank you so much for being here. When I figure out how to do this, I am going to look at any questions that I may have received, but thank you for joining me today, and I wish you all the very best.